As you've heard on Bridge City News, Prime Minister Justin Trudeau announced that he will be resigning as both Prime Minister and Liberal Party leader once a new leader is chosen. In the meantime, Parliament has been prorogued until March 24th. Now, many in Canada are celebrating the fact that we'll be heading back to the polls this year and may in fact see a change in government. Now, here in Alberta, Premier Danielle Smith is once again not happy with Justin Trudeau. To weigh in on this topic is our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post, Tyler Dawson, who joins us once again from Edmonton. Tyler, what beef does the Premier have this time around?
Well, what beef doesn't she have with the Prime Minister? At this particular moment, she's upset that there was this announcement that was basically not an election, not an immediate resignation. As you alluded to, Trudeau has kind of kicked the can down the road a little bit with the prorogation of Parliament, the announcement that there's going to be a Liberal Party leadership race. At some point after all of this, there ought to be an election. And so Premier Danielle Smith's view on this, which I think is probably shared by a lot of people around the country and certainly conservative politicians, is that, this sort of A, delays the inevitable, and B, we're going into a relatively tense period of negotiations between Canada and the United States. And perhaps this means we have sort of a lame duck government, and perhaps it would have been better if we'd gone into an immediate election to select a new prime minister who could then go on to negotiate with the incoming U.S. administration. Of course, one of the actual quirks to this is, let's say hypothetically that Trudeau had called an election earlier this week. The minimum period for an election in Canada is 37 days. So, and Trump's going to be inaugurated in the quick math at 12 days, I think. So even if there was an election called on Monday, we would actually be fully without a government for the first few weeks of a Trump presidency. So is it better to have a bit of a lame duck government? Would it be better to go into an election? I don't know. But either way, the Premier certainly thinks that this puts Canada in a weak negotiating position, that it does not project the necessary stability to the United States and the incoming president, and that Trudeau should be gone. So that's a rapid review of what's going on in Alberta and federal political circles right now.
Tyler, the province has signed a deal with Enbridge to look into doubling Alberta's oil production and increasing exports to the United States. Premier Smith has already said that even though Trump is threatening those 25% tariffs on Canadian products, we won't do the same thing when it comes to our oil to the United States, correct?
Yeah, she does not seem to be in favor of sort of a tit for tat or a reciprocal sort of tariff scheme to sort of either punish the United States in some fashion or strengthen Canada's negotiating position in some fashion. Whether or not either of those things would be true in that case is certainly debatable. But no, the Premier is not in favor of any sort of retaliation, particularly when it comes to energy. She has been on this relatively significant, I would say, sort of hearts and minds campaign in the United States, appearing on American news programs. Met with, I think the last time we talked about her meeting with a bunch of governors in Las Vegas. There's all sorts of stuff sort of going on in the background, it seems, and publicly as well, for that matter, to try and make Americans aware, I guess, of what some of the consequences of these tariffs might be for them. Because, of course, we don't pay tariffs on imports to the United States. Americans are going to foot the bill for this. So this announcement was sort of interesting timing. I mean, first of all, it was made in the middle of everyone paying attention to Trudeau's announcement on Monday. And secondly, it just comes at an interesting time, because the idea is that Enbridge could find ways to get a few 100,000 more barrels of oil per day to sort of Midwestern U.S. refineries. They're all retrofitted to process Canadian heavy crude. And so this is sort of like clearing the pipes, let's say. If you create this capacity for more shipments of oil, that could lead to the impetus to produce more barrels of oil. I mean, you don't want to have a circumstance like we did back in 2018, when there was way more oil than there was pipeline capacity to take it away. And so the Alberta government is also going to use its own sort of supply of oil. It's a bit of a complicated system, but basically, instead of receiving royalty payments in cash, they can take royalty payments in barrels of oil. And so the Alberta government sort of owns a stockpile of oil. And those stockpiles can be used to backstop some of these projects. So you say, look, you come up with 200,000 barrels of oil worth of capacity in your pipeline network. We can guarantee 50,000 barrels per day. That will, keep the pipeline full. This is the same thing that happened with the Sturgeon refinery. This is the same thing that happened with Keystone XL when Rachel Notley was premier. This is an old an old method of sort of backstopping projects. So a lot going on in that particular space, but it's crucial to note as well. This is sort of an agreement to explore the possibility of these things. Enbridge is not doubling its mainline capacity in the next couple of weeks or something like that. This is simply looking at a way to increase export capacity with a view to doubling oil production in the province, which is something Smith has advocated for a long time.
Tyler, with Smith attending Donald Trump's inauguration in less than 2 weeks' time, is there a plan to meet with Donald Trump to talk about those potentially harming tariffs?
Great question. I've asked the Premier's office to tell me what she hopes to achieve on that trip and haven't actually heard back yet. I would be shocked if the Premier got a meeting with Donald Trump, I have to say. It would certainly make for an interesting photo op, but is the president going to be meeting with premiers of an Alberta of a Canadian province on his first day in office? I find that unlikely. She will, however, be on hand to glad hand with some of the governors who are present, some of the senators and Congress people who she feels might be influential on some of the debates about tariffs and things like that. So I think we'll have to sort of wait and see what comes out of it. As far as I can tell, she's going to be the only Canadian premier at the actual inauguration. I mean, that helps because we have that trade office in Washington, and that seems to be how they sort of secured an actual invite. So I'm sure she's going to have a very full social schedule. But it'll be interesting to see who she does manage to meet with, which might be a way to gauge the degree of success that this trip has had.
The governments of Alberta and Saskatchewan have both spoken out against the equalization payments, Tyler. Billions of dollars given out to other provinces, including over $13 billion to Quebec, but nothing, nada, for BC, Alberta, and Saskatchewan. Can you explain how the equalization system really works?
Yeah, it works like this. You and I, everyone watching this program, pays taxes to the federal government. Our income tax, our general sales tax, all that goes into general revenues. The federal government then looks at that big pot of money and looks at provinces around the country and looks at their fiscal capacity, basically. So can Prince Edward Island, on its tax base with its revenues, finance public services that are comparable to Alberta or British Columbia or Ontario or Quebec? And if those provinces do not have the fiscal capacity to do that, the federal government then disperses money from that general pot of revenues to those provinces to ensure that public services are all sort of maintained at a similar level across the country. So in other words, it's not quite what politicians like to say. They often say, this is taking money from Alberta, this is taking money from Saskatchewan. I mean, it is in the sense that all of us pay taxes, but it's not taking money from the Alberta government, for example. Either way, the fact of the matter is you have these sort of three have provinces, Alberta, Saskatchewan, British Columbia, who are not getting any money. Ontario is getting money this year. It's not very much in the grand scheme of things. But this is always controversial, right? We have some version of this debate every year. There's always talk about reforming the equalization formula. And in fact, there's a pretty wide-ranging consensus, actually, that the equalization formula should be amended. Does that mean that Alberta is suddenly going to be getting equalization payments? No, probably not, but it might change the threshold a little bit for Ontario, for example. So I think actually one of the open questions, new Liberal leader potentially, new prime minister, election at some point this year, is whether or not there's going to be any discussion on actually reforming that system, particularly from the Conservatives, who, of course, also want votes in Ontario and Quebec and the Maritimes, where equalization certainly benefits those people.
Many of us have been trying to get more information from the Smith government regarding a potential Alberta-made pension plan, Tyler. The province is refusing to release that information, and the Office of the Privacy Commissioner has now opened 2 investigations into that refusal.
Yeah, so this is basically over the survey data that the Alberta government did, this sort of survey public consultation on Albertans' openness, I guess you could say, to an Alberta pension plan. They have all that data. They're using it internally for whatever. And journalists want it. We want to see it. We want the public to see it. And the government has sort of consistently refused to release that data. And so the Office of the Privacy Commissioner, which also sort of handles what are called access to information requests or freedom of information requests, has opened investigations into this. Now, the development on this was on Sunday when Premier Danielle Smith was on her regular radio show. She was asked about that information, that survey data. And what she said was, well, we're using that data to decide whether or not we're going to hold a referendum on creating an Alberta pension plan. Once that decision has been made by cabinet, she said, they will then release that data. So we may see that information at some point, and it ought to also come around the time whether or not we find out if there's going to be a referendum. Of course, the other development in this, which I don't know if we discussed before the Christmas break, was that the federal government responded with its estimate on how much Alberta would get from the CPP if it left. Now, people will probably recall that when this was first announced in September 2023, it must have been, they said that Alberta was going to get, I think it was $334 billion. It was like 53% of the CPP. And it was, this astronomical number. And that was really part of the major sales pitch for the pension plan. The chief actuary of the federal government did their own analysis and since has come back and said, well, actually, if Alberta left, it would get sort of between 20 and 25% of the CPP, not more than half of it. So that has certainly, I think, taken some wind out of the provincial government's sails on this file.
The latest iteration in the wine war between British Columbia and Alberta has finally come to an end, Tyler. Alberta will now allow Albertans to order directly from BC wineries following an agreement that was signed. What was Alberta fighting for in that agreement?
Well, Alberta was basically mad that it wasn't getting tax revenue from alcohol sales. If you ordered directly from a winery in BC, of course, you pay the provincial sales tax, the provincial alcohol tax. It comes in the mail and, you get your wine. If you go to a liquor store in Alberta, of course, you're paying Alberta tax on that alcohol. So last January, the AGLC, which governs alcohol, gaming, cannabis, maybe a couple other things. Anyways, they said that Alberta liquor stores were no longer going to stock wine from BC wineries that were doing direct consumer sales because Alberta was missing out on its tax revenue. So this agreement that has now been inked will allow Albertans to order from BC wineries. There will be some back-end system between the two provincial governments that will see Alberta get a portion of that tax. So Alberta's happy with it. The wineries are presumably happy with it, that they get to sell here again, and all's hunky-dory. It's only going to last for a year, and then the scheme's sort of going to be reviewed to see if it actually worked. So, the wine war of 2024 could flare up again in a year's time.
Now, speaking of taxes, Tyler, a couple of new taxes began in Alberta this year. The first is a 20% increase to the tax on vaping products, and the second impacts those who drive electric vehicles. Can you explain?
Yeah, so there's got to be someone in Alberta who is the first person to go re-register their electric car at some point in the last week who had to pay $200. They've got to be out there. If you're watching this program, give me a call. I'd like to talk to you. What the Alberta government did was they introduced a $200 fee for electric vehicles when you announce or when you go in to renew your registration for your vehicle. The logic was basically that every year people who drive gas or diesel cars are paying the Alberta fuel tax, and they are paying sort of, on average about $200 a year in that tax. And so they're saying that, well, if there's more electric vehicles, first of all, we're missing out on revenue. And second of all, electric car owners, by not paying the fuel tax, are not contributing to sort of the upkeep and maintenance of Alberta's roadways. So that's the government's logic here. You could say it's a crass revenue generating scheme. It will generate about $5 million this year, apparently. You could say it's some way to force people to sell their electric vehicles to buy internal combustion engine vehicles. I mean, I don't really buy that, but certainly some people do. Either way, it was kind of controversial when it was first announced, and it's now in effect. And so people who have their Teslas or their Polestars, when they go to renew their insurance, or their registration, I should say, they're going to have to pay that. And then, of course, on the vaping front, I mean, that's just there's always an annual increase to taxes, to sin taxes, as some call them. And the logic being that if it's more expensive, fewer people are going to do it. But certainly a couple things that people will notice on their pocketbooks this year.
It's funny, I see a lot of those Model S Teslas driving around the city. I'm like, those are sleek, good-looking little cars.
They are.
And then I see the Cybertruck. I'm like, what were they thinking? Tyler, Alberta NDP leader Ned Nenshi has finally chosen where he's going to run to secure a seat at the legislature. With Rachel Notley stepping down as MLA, Nenshi will be running in her old riding of Strathcona. Would it be safe to say that it's an NDP stronghold, so it really shouldn't be much of a problem for Nenshi to win once the by-election is called? Yeah,
I mean, there's certainly no safer seat in Alberta. It might be like the safest NDP seat in the country. It's a very, very safe seat for them. It's held both federally and provincially by a New Democrat, has been for quite some time. I think since the Harper years was the last time that there was a Conservative MP federally in that riding. Anyhow, Rachel Notley, she's out. She's retired. So, and Nenshi's been weird, right? Like, people have been talking about this quite a bit for the last couple months. What is he up to? What has he been doing? He's just not that publicly It's just not that out there, which is maybe not what you would expect from an opposition leader when there's certainly been lots to talk about over the past 6 months. And at least part of that is because he hasn't been in the legislature. He hasn't been there, haranguing the government about whatever. He hasn't had some of the media opportunities as a result. So he's now said that he's going to run in this riding, very safe riding. I would certainly expect him to win that. The open question, of course, is come the 2027 election, will he run in that riding again? Or will he return to his hometown and try and take a run at a Calgary riding, which would be, I think, certainly more challenging for him and riskier for him.
He's our legislative reporter and the Alberta correspondent for the National Post. Tyler Dawson, thanks again for joining us today from Edmonton.
Thanks for having me, Hal.